Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to TFR Newsroom. And today we have with us once again Dirk Hohndel, now Chief Open Source Officer at Cardano Foundation. Dirk, first of all, it's great to have you back on the show after a long time.
Thanks, Swap. It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, and as you know, once you left your previous job, I was curious what will be the next in your journey. So I want to understand from you about this phase of your journey, why you make this decision, what kind of got you attracted towards them?
Well, I'll answer the question slightly differently. If you look back through what I've done in my career, I have a habit of going places where people say, "Why the heck is he going there?" When I joined Intel in 2001, many of my best friends said, "Why are you going there? This is, Intel. They're evil. They're part of Wintel. All they do is Microsoft." And I joined Intel with the idea of helping them understand open source and creating an open source strategy around their technology and making them a valid player in the Linux space. And then 15 years later, when I joined VMware, I got pretty much the same responses from pretty much the same people. Because at that point, VMware was not necessarily seen as a positive force in the open source space. And that's why I joined them. And so I was looking for, once again, such a transformational opportunity. I was looking for something where I felt that I could help make a difference in an industry, a difference based on what I like doing with open source, bringing open source methodology, open source approaches, open source governance into a technology space that is interesting and hopefully innovative and fast moving. And so I looked at a number of different areas, and I talked to quite a few companies in the couple of months since I've left VMware. And meeting the folks from the Cardano Foundation was super interesting because they have what I believe is a fascinating technology in a certainly very hot and fast-moving space, and with a lot of questions around it. There is a lot of skepticism around blockchain technologies. And so to me, that was a perfect combination to find a space where I could once again do my thing and help bring open source methodology into a new industry, into a new space.
Excellent. And I'll talk about, of course, your role there. But since this is the first time I'm kind of covering Cardano, maybe our news team might have covered them, but this is the first time I'm talking to somebody from the foundation. And since you are new there, so I'm assuming that I know about the foundation as much as you. Of course, you know a bit more about that. But given that, so if I ask you, first of all, just for the sake of our viewers, tell us a bit about what is Cardano all about. Of course, there is a blockchain technology, but tell us a bit more about what is the project all about. Then we'll talk about the role of the foundation there.
The Cardano blockchain is a proof of stake blockchain technology that is focused on higher level value contracts and data on the blockchain. So it's not a transactional blockchain that simply stores transaction, a token changes ownership from here to there. But a lot of the development work that has happened in this space in the last year and a half has all been about smart contracts, about scalability, about the ability to do more interesting, higher value transactions on a permissionless public ledger that is actually immutable. And so if you look at this larger blockchain space, a lot of different type of technologies are lumped into that same term and often are talked about as if they were all the same, when in fact they're not. And so having spent some time trying to understand more what is out there and what would be interesting for me to engage in, I was quite intrigued by what they do very much on the technology side. Now, the setup here is slightly interesting because there is a separate company that is a commercial entity that is working on a lot of the base implementation work and a lot of the more traditional areas of development around the Cardano blockchain. So that's IOG. And the Cardano Foundation was specifically put in place to help evolve and grow what is being done with the technology. And so this is why my role is actually at the Cardano Foundation, in order to help grow the opportunities and the technology base for the Cardano blockchain and help create an open source based third-party contributor network around that. And so that's really why I ended up where I am.
I don't want to go too much into detail of the technology, but one of the things with Cardano is also most of the blockchain is decentralized, where we assume the things are spread across the globe, so it's kind of better than centralized. Now, with this war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, where a country can shut down the whole internet for the rest of the world, other countries might do the same thing. So at one point we felt that decentralized technology better because bits are stored in different. But if 60% of those bits are in a certain country, and if that country shuts down, then have you given any thought to the impact on decentralized technologies like these?
I'm always worried when we try to be too naive in our approach of thinking about an interesting technology and what it means for the world and a specific, in this case, highly volatile political situation. I mean, the war of aggression that Russia is forcing on the people in Ukraine is horrifying. And I certainly want to do everything to help end that and return Ukraine to its independence. But I don't think that's what this technology is about. But on a more abstract level, the idea of decentralized technology and the idea of having a distributed ledger that makes it impossible for an individual power to go in and say, oh, we can just change the records. We can pretend that these ownership records that are here in that public ledger are no longer there. There is a lot of value to that. And obviously, in the run-up to the war and now in the first few months of the war, a lot was talked about the fact that records that are in a blockchain cannot easily be falsified by an aggressor, by a superpower. And that to me has a lot of value. But the core to this value to me is always about people and not about politics. So how can we use this to actually create interesting solutions, something that makes a difference to people and not try to get carried away with slightly larger goals than we can actually achieve. One of the things that people confuse is distributed and decentralized. If you have distributed data where a chunk of the data is everywhere, but you need to have all of these chunks in order to have all of the data, that creates a very fragile environment. The odd thing about the way the decentralized computing in most blockchains is implemented is that the complete information is in multiple places. So even if someone gets control of one of the copies, they can't do anything to change history because there are so many copies of this around that it will be immediately obvious if someone tries to falsify data. So the decentralized nature here is very much about redundancy and about immutability. It's that immutability that makes the technology interesting, to be honest.
No, and thanks for once again explain the kind of slight difference between decentralized versus distributed. And we often make mistakes of bundling them together. Now going back to the foundation part, of course, Cardano, it's an open source technology either way. So when you talked about Intel, when you talked about VMware, of course, those companies were not known for open source. They might be doing a little bit of open source, but now they are doing a lot. But here, there's already a lot of open source going on. So the challenges for you are not as big as they were in the previous roles. So talk about,
Interesting statement, because one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot over the last few years is that open source is more than, oh, my sources are on GitHub. In the blockchain space, we have a ton of companies who have their sources available in GitHub. And they are under an open source license. And so a lot of people say, oh, it's open source. Well, maybe. But of course, the question becomes, what is your governance model? How can someone contribute? How are decisions made? How is the roadmap decided? How is the community working together to define the next milestones? What is the ability of an individual to add certain APIs that they may need to the infrastructure. And then, of course, how do you actually get from those sources to something that you can run? Are the sources actually delivered together with all the tools and all the scripting that are needed for you to then take use of that and make something of it? And so the a lot of people seem to think that it's that releasing of the source code under an open source license that's the hard part, because in many companies, the lawyers saying no, we can't do that makes that seem like the big hurdle. But if I look at the large space of open source software out there and the relatively small number of truly successful open source projects, I always think it's that other part that is really hard. Getting the governance right, getting the community right, getting the engagement models right, making sure that you bring the right people together within the right framework and can create a thriving, successful open source project. And so, sure, the challenges are different, but I think the challenges are no smaller than they were in my other jobs.
And once again, you said it's right, and we have talked about that earlier. The code is actually, if not the least, not the most important part of open source community is, as you mentioned, the people, community, collaboration, governance. Those are the things that ensure the sustainability of that code that was created in the first place. So now going back to and this question, once again, it depends on how you want to look at it, is that blockchain technologies is finding its niche in a lot of industries, but then there are, a lot of, you can also say, competing technologies. They are, they can be complementing each other. There are different foundations also there. Since you have been in space for so long, you have seen how there are different projects trying to do the same thing. What do you see in the blockchain spaces going on to further either help with consolidation? Because when there is too many projects, adoption can become a hindrance as well.
So we often see consolidation in spaces as they mature, right? And I think right now we are still very much in the early growth phase of the blockchain space. A lot of fascinating new ideas are being tried, and some of them fail, some of them succeed. We see a lot of experimentation. We see a lot of wild, wild west in this space. And we also see some super cool technologies, and we see some ideas that we haven't seen in the past. One of the things that attracted me to the Cardano Foundation was this fundamental belief that if you're building something like this, that is all built on the idea of cryptography and on the math behind this, that you should really start with the research paper. You should start with creating the research that figures out how do you actually do this correctly, and then take it from there to an implementation, ideally in a way where you can prove the correctness of your implementation. And so the Cardano ecosystem is built around more than 100 research papers that have started as the underlying body of material to make sure that what is being built actually works and that we can prove that it works. And then that the implementations that are being created relate directly to this research. Now, this sounds great, right? But of course, there are a couple of downsides to this approach. It takes a little longer. It means you need to spend the time to get this right. Also, one of the challenges in this space is that the programming languages that are being used to do this, to implement these mathematical proofs and to do this in a verifiable manner, tend to be not our most popular programming languages in this space or in the larger industry. So a lot of the code for the Cardano Foundation is actually implemented in Haskell, which is not one of the top 10 programming languages that you read in all the curricula if you look at the universities. And it's not one of the hot growing, it's not Rust, it's not Go, right? So there are some challenges in this, but the underlying value that we are creating here, I think, absolutely makes it worth it. And so we'll need to figure out, how do we bring more people into this space? How do we get more people to be comfortable Haskell developers? How do we create a larger community around that? Because we are creating software stack, we're creating software that shows that the approach is correct. One of the big reasons for pride in the Cardano Foundation is that this blockchain has not gone down. So this blockchain continues to run and to execute the transactions that are being sent to it without embarrassing, oh, right now, sorry, you can't transact because our blockchain is down. So there is a lot of value here. And for me, again, I'm fairly new to all this and I'm still learning every day. We all make this joke about drinking from the fire hose. Right now, it feels like drinking from multiple fire hoses. But fundamentally, everything that I've seen so far around the technology is super interesting. And now I want to take that and bring this to my vision or the shared vision of a lot of people around how open source can thrive, how open source can make an interesting technology into a successful movement that makes a difference.
That actually does bring us back to the point of when we were talking about the challenge at VMware or Intel were different than here. But the big challenge with whenever a technology is at an early stage, the challenge actually becomes same as with open source in the early days. A lot of education is needed, a lot of misinformation is there, a lot of communication is there. You have to build a lot of communities. So from blockchain's perspective, what are some of the challenges that you do see in the space? Because first of all, adoption is already there, but it's niche, the financial fintech and all those, they are using it. But broadly speaking, you talked about, of course, languages are there. So from your perspective or within your role that you're like, hey, these are the challenges that I do see, and these are the ones that I want to handle or tackle.
So there are a lot of challenges that I see that I will not be the lead person to handle. There are challenges around regulatory aspects. There are challenges around just creating more business opportunities and engagements with the existing players in the financial services industry, but also in just software industry and enterprise. There are so many use cases that I think our biggest challenge is our own bandwidth, our ability to engage with all the people where this would be an interesting technology to talk about. For me personally, what I look at as my first challenges is of course this whole space of creating a healthy, thriving community, creating an environment where we attract more developers, and creating an infrastructure, a governance, a larger space, for lack of a better term, that can be seen as the center of where blockchain technology, where the Cardano technology grows and has its home. And this sounds very subtle and weird, but to me, in my experience, the idea of having a place where people feel this is where this community comes together, this is where we as a community make the decisions of where we are taking this, where we can have both the technical but also the strategic and philosophical conversations around this technology. That, in my experience, is a big part of creating a successful open source project, a successful open source community. And frankly, this is where I have a lot more to learn about what exists today. Where are we? What is the status quo? And then I want to bring in some of my experience and some of the things that I know work in the space and help foster more growth.
Now, this is a kind of higher level, discussion or question where I just, it's more of an opinion that I want to ask you is that what role do you see of blockchain technologies in our digital lives in general? We talk about metaverse a lot these days. In early days, if you look at, when we were talking about encryption, it was more or less like, hey, only, specific business use cases, but now everything is getting end-to-end encryption. So do you also see that blockchain technologies, will become, and it might actually become a de facto or default way we create, it doesn't matter what kind of transaction we are doing today because everything is becoming digitized?
Well, so this is one of those interesting questions where you can take the answer in many different ways. I love the enthusiasm that a lot of people in the blockchain space have. And the enthusiasm is infectious, and it's wonderful to see where people believe that every problem in the world has a blockchain answer. I'll admit I'm a little older and I've been around a few technology revolutions in my life. I have a slightly more pragmatic approach. So I don't think that we have the solution to every problem. Now we just need to tell you how to change your problem so it fits our solution. So I much more think there are a lot of problems out there for which blockchain actually is a great solution. And I think there are more than enough spaces that have that characteristic to keep us busy for many years to come before we need to try and evangelize the world to everything needs to be blockchain. Having said that, if you look at some of the fundamental characteristics that we are looking for in the blockchain, so immutability, the idea that when you record something, it cannot be changed. And by the way, there are blockchains out there that are maybe not as immutable as they should be, and that have incidences in their past where they decided to rewrite their history. Well, then maybe you aren't really as blockchainy as you claim to be. The other thing is the ability to actually have deterministic execution. So if this happens and this other thing happens and this third thing happens, then the following outcome is recorded. And so again, this is this idea of a smart contract where you can embed certain conditions in a transaction, and as these conditions become true, the transaction happens. And if they don't come through, the transaction is unwound. A lot of this technology has direct applications in a lot of real world scenarios. Obviously, everyone talks about I give you a loan, and here's how we structure things, and here's how the decisions are being made about collateral and all that. And obviously, that's a very easy to understand use case. But there are many more use cases along the very same lines where you want to be able to respond to outside indicators and then make decisions and have different actions happen as part of a contract, as part of something where you don't need a central trusted arbiter, a central instance that now suddenly is in a position of control, but instead where you have two parties working at arm's length with each other, using the technology to ensure that what they agreed upon upfront then actually happens at the end. So these are two of the typical use cases that we talk about. Another one that I talk a lot about is this idea of being able to document transactions in a way that allows traceability of what has happened. A lot of people always think that blockchain is all about untraceability and total anonymity. Well, actually, that's not what they're about. That's how they're hyped, and that's how they're often used as a way to anonymize transactions. But fundamentally, there is an ID attached to every transaction. That's how it works. And so the question is, can a blockchain be part of an identity solution? So you create a digital identity through a blockchain, and then you can use that to do other transactions in the digital world, or maybe even in the non-digital world. So there is a lot of opportunity here. There is a lot of interesting use cases. And there are a lot of use cases that people are just starting to glimpse at, are just starting to look at, oh, here are all these things that we could do if we spent more time on this. So I think there is a huge, huge opportunity here. And as I said, it's a young technology. It's something that's just starting to gain traction.
Dirk, once again, thank you for taking time out today, and of course, talk about the foundation, your role, to be honest, more importantly, the role of blockchain in our world. What are the things that we should be getting excited about, and what are the things that don't make much sense? So, thanks for sharing those insights, and of course, I would love to have you back on the show when you have much stronger grasp on this foundation and your role. Thank you.
Thanks, Swab. I always enjoy our conversations, and I find it quite encouraging that with all the changes in what I've been doing, the core topics that we're talking about still are community and open source and how to create great technology. So that red thread seems to keep going on. So I look forward to more conversations. Thank you.